Today's show is brought to you by City Theater. If you're a Jane Austen fan, or maybe just really into Bridgerton or Downton Abbey, and you're looking to get into the holiday spirit, you've got to check out this new show based on the classic novel Pride and Prejudice. It's called The Wickhams, Christmas at Pemberley. It opens November 30th at City Theater on the South Side, and the whole show focuses on the house staff's scandals during an impromptu, unwelcome, middle-of-the-night visit to the Darcy family home by none other than the dastardly Mr. Wickham. You can catch this story all about the season of forgiveness at City Theater through December 22nd. Get your tickets at citytheatercompany.org and use the code CityCast for $5 off your order. Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, if you search for a city's birthday, at least here in Pennsylvania, you will often find multiple dates for its founding, incorporation, for becoming a borough, and in our case, a full-grown city. Well, according to today's guest, Pittsburgh's first birthday is today, our 266th birthday, and looking mighty fine, I gotta say. So we're taking it way, way back to the mid-1700s to talk about why we're not for sure which date we should use, the history that got us here, and how you can celebrate this week. It's Monday, November 25th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh is talking about. Mike Burke is the assistant director at the Fort Pitt Museum. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I understand there's a milestone day in your family today as well.
Yes, that's right. It's my wife Adrian's birthday, and I won't say how old she is, but happy birthday, honey.
Not 266.
No, much younger.
So we've got all these birthdays here as a city, but let's start from the beginning. Who lived in this region first?
Well, I think, and this is a point that we kind of make at the Fort Pitt Museum, it's important for people around here to realize that the native history of what's now Western Pennsylvania goes back 19,000 years. Mm-hmm. And that's documented at places like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, in Avella, PA, which is part of the Heinz History Center Family Museums and also a National Historic Landmark. So people have been here for a long time. Native people have been here for a very long time. And that is, their presence essentially continues unabated right up to the period of the arrival of Europeans. Mm-hmm. And so if you fast forward to kind of like the early 1600s, the very last culture to live in this region prior to European colonization is known to archaeologists as the Monongahela culture. That's a name kind of imposed by academics and archaeologists. We don't know their name for themselves because we don't know for sure that they ever actually had contact with Europeans. And they are in the region until like the early 1600s, so the time that English colonists are arriving at Jamestown and Plymouth.
Around our eastern coastal areas.
Exactly. And we also don't know the reason that they ceased to be in the Ohio country. It could be a variety of factors. It could be climatic factors, crop yields. There could be warfare, with other nations. But suffice to say, by about 1630, they're gone from the region and the archaeological record. And then into this kind of large sort of empty quarter, other nations start to move. And there are nations like the Lenape or the Delaware people, Shawnees, who were an Ohio country tribe, are forced out into the Carolinas. Also Iroquoian people, Senecas and Cayugas from up north, and other people from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or the Iroquois Confederacy are also kind of moving into the upper Ohio Valley at that point in the late 17th, early 18th century.
What did our region, like what we consider like, the city, the Golden Triangle, what did that look like at that time?
It's kind of an interesting situation that develops with all of these native people from different nations. Mm-hmm. They move here, they establish villages, and it's, obviously because they're forced out of their original homelands, but this becomes kind of a sanctuary for a lot of native people. And regardless of the language or dialect that they speak, they all begin to refer to this area as Allegheny. And it's a name that exists probably before they arrive. That's just a name for the region. And so when Pennsylvania traders start to follow them out here in the 1720s, they come back and say, all these native people from different nations have settled this place called Allegheny.
Do we know why this region became kind of that like congregate point, in the way that it did? I mean, is it literally because of the point and the rivers and all of that?
Yeah, I think it's a few reasons. One, it's devoid of other human inhabitants, by the early 1700s. And so if you're being forced out of one homeland, it's a good choice. But also the rivers are the critical factor, and they provide tremendous access to the interior of the continent. And so all of these villages spring up around rivers.
Well, so then Europeans start to arrive. About when did they get here, and how did that change some of that?
Europeans follow native people from the very moment they move out here. If you think of the Delaware people, they've been trading with Europeans for 100 years before they move into the Ohio country. And so the traders from Pennsylvania who follow them are bringing necessary goods to their communities. And so that exists very early on. It's in the 1740s that the French, who have colonies in Canada and Louisiana, begin to be interested in the Ohio Valley. Mm-hmm. And so in 1749, they mount an expedition coming down the Allegheny River, putting lead plates in the ground at the confluence of major streams to indicate the ownership of the King of France. And so you could see how if this was you're forced from your actual homeland, you've adopted this new homeland, that would really incense native people who had settled here. And so initially there's sort of more of an alliance between native folks in this region and the British than with the French.
The British didn't try to plant a flag right away?
They're actually a Seneca leader named Snoggerson who requests that the British build a fortified storehouse at the forks of the Ohio River, where Pittsburgh is today. And so in 1754, the colony of Virginia sends a little force to this region to build that storehouse, and they name it Fort Prince George. And they essentially no sooner get the gates hung on Fort Prince George than the French arrived and evict them. But in that moment, the point changes hand without a shot being fired, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, what made us significant in that moment? 1754, we're founded not too far after that. What happened in those 4 years, in that period, that makes, Pittsburgh worth fighting over?
There's a really intense interest in the access to the continent that the rivers provide. And so if you're the French and you have colonies in Canada and Louisiana, the way to connect them through an all-water route is via the Ohio River. And so that's why they want to be here. The British, and this becomes more apparent to native people in time, the British have this interest in settlement, kind of acquiring the land and selling it and settling it. And over time, native people begin to see that as a greater threat to their communities. And so, but that's kind of the interest in the Ohio Valley, is that it's sort of the key to the continent. And if you overlay all the interests, the Delaware, Shawnee, Haudenosaunee, French, and British, I think you would see that in the middle of all these overlapping kind of claims to the land, there's this dark and really conflicted blob in the middle, and that's where Pittsburgh is today.
I mean, well, so what led to the actual moment of our founding then? The
French take over control of the point in 1754, and they build Fort Duquesne soon after that. And it's always a very small and in some ways inadequate fort for the amount of troops that they want to station here. But they managed to hold on to the point for 4 years. The British send an expedition in 1755 under Edward Braddock, and it makes it about as far as the town of Braddock today. And they are absolutely routed by this force of 600 or 800 native warriors and a few French officers and troops.
On foot, I would say that is not very close.
Right. But having come from Virginia and cut a road up over the mountains, they were really on the doorstep.
That's true. That's true. Okay. We'll give them more credit than that.
And so that's as close as they get to Fort Duquesne. And then it's 3 more years until the British are able to mount a follow-up expedition.
Well, so what happens then? Like I assume there's a clash of some kind on the point.
So there is a new British general who's placed in charge of this campaign, and he decides rather than coming from Virginia north, he's going to go across the colony of Pennsylvania. And his name's John Forbes. So in the summer of 1758, they begin this campaign. The 2 lessons that Forbes takes from Braddock, one, he decides to go very slowly and methodically, making a fort or a station every 45 miles or so across Pennsylvania. And we can see these today from Carlisle onward, Fort Loudon, Fort Littleton, Bedford, Ligonier. These are stations on the Forbes Road. Forbes begins this kind of slow march across Pennsylvania. He also kind of corrects an error of Braddock's, and insofar as he reaches out to the native tribes to kind of get their blessing for what he's trying to do. And so they do a peace treaty, or they make a peace treaty at Easton, Pennsylvania in the summer of 1758. And that also sort of paves the way for the Forbes campaign's success. They make it about as far as Loyalhanna or Ligonier today in 1758, by November of 1758. And in the 18th century, that's typically when the winter season is when the campaign ends, because they don't have the ability to predict the weather, and nobody wants to be caught in a giant snowstorm while they're in the middle of a campaign. And so they decide to halt at Loyalhanna or Ligonier and don't go any further. Forbes is at that time dying, and we don't know if he realizes how near the end is, but he's dying of an illness that might be stomach cancer. That's always kind of in the background. He has to be carried most of the way.
Oh, wow.
He's physically incapacitated. And on the 11th of November, they hold a council of war, and they decide that the risks of trying to take Fort Duquesne, even though they're not very far away, far outweigh the benefits. And so they're going to halt the campaign there for the season. On the 12th, George Washington captures a French deserter, and they get some intelligence that Fort Duquesne's defenses are very weak, and Forbes immediately decides, we're going to go for it.
So they make the decision. It's go time. Then what?
So they begin then this slow march to Fort Duquesne.
Once again, Ligonier, very far away from Pittsburgh if you're traveling on foot.
Right. And you can, and again, what they're doing is trying to cut the road ahead of them. Forbes has something like 7,000 troops in his army.
That's true. I'm thinking about this from turnpike terms. And of course, there's none of that. You're literally bushwhacking through the Allegheny Forest.
It's a big open stretch of forest that you have to get through. And you have to bring, all your troops and artillery and things like that through the forest. And so they get to within about 12 miles of Fort Duquesne on the 24th. And it's during that time that they're waiting for more intelligence from the native guides who are out keeping an eye on the French. And it's at that time when they hear the explosion. The French have actually detonated the powder magazine of Fort Duquesne.
On purpose?
On purpose, because they realize Forbes is on their doorstep. They cannot defend the point against this vastly numerically superior British force. And so they decide to abandon the fort, but they're going to blow up their powder magazine to avoid that falling into the British hands. From their position, they hear this explosion, and Forbes immediately sends his light horse troops. So these are like soldiers who fought on horseback. He sends them to the point to see if the French have abandoned the fort. And if they have abandoned the fort, they're supposed to take control of Fort Duquesne. And they do that on the evening of the 24th. The following day, the 25th, Forbes then mobilizes his army, and they begin that last kind of stretch to Fort Duquesne. And that 12 miles takes them essentially all day. And they arrive about 6 p.m. on the evening of the 25th.
So the full force of the British forces, such as they were at the time, including their very terminally ill general, arrive in Pittsburgh on November 25th, 1758. And so that, your argument means that is the day that Pittsburgh was founded, such as we know it now.
Yes. And I think there's even more evidence to suggest that is when it is called Pittsburgh.
Okay, lay it on me after the break.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How Did you?
and spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
So you argue today is Pittsburgh's birthday. If you go back in history, it's the first day that begins the trajectory of it becoming the city we know today. So back in time, it's 1758. The dying General Forbes arrives at the point with this huge number of troops to the flaming ruins of Fort Duquesne. It's also this time of year. It's November, so it's cold, it's dusky, it's dark. And they get there and they start writing these letters.
Right. Henry Bouquet, who's Forbes' second in command, writes several letters from the camp at Fort Duquesne on the evening of the 25th. They write more letters on the 26th, just going out, sending the word out that they've captured Fort Duquesne. And you also see on the morning of the 26th, in print, at least for the first time, you start to see the camp at Fort Duquesne, now called Pittsburgh.
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned these letters because now it's ringing a bell. Like we talked to a historian, Virginia Montanez, who writes for Pittsburgh Magazine quite a lot, who talked to us about the letters and the spelling of Pittsburgh, because some of those letters go out with an H and some of those letters go out without an H. And thus the question of whether we are Pittsburgh or Pittsboro is born.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a question that we've kind of, wrestled with, tried to figure out too.
Yeah.
There's another clue though, that the name actually is probably on Forbes's lips as soon as they arrive. And that is that when they are at Loyal Hannah, what's Ligonier today, there's a very brief window when they refer to that place as Pittsboro. Because as far as we know, maybe Forbes thought that was the terminus of the campaign. That's as far as they were going to make it. He may have thought, this is as far as I'm going to make it. Sees himself as dying at that point. But there's a couple-day window where they refer to Loyal Hannah as Pittsboro. When they decide to march on Fort Duquesne, that usage stops immediately. But it's in Forbes's mind. And so
he's already decided what the city he's marching towards is going to be called. So if we're stopping here, it's this one. If we're stopping further ahead, it's that one.
Which is why I would kind of put forth the case that from the moment he lays eyes on the point, on the smoldering ruins of Fort Duquesne, he calls it Pittsboro. I
feel like through most of this conversation, we've referred to it as Fort Duquesne. Is this when it became Fort Pitt?
Good question. The British take control of Fort Duquesne in November of 1750.
What's left of it?
What's left of it. The ground there at the point. And it's not until the following September that they begin construction of Fort Pitt. So after all this celebratory stuff, on the 27th, they go out and they start to bury the troops that were killed in Grant's defeat in September of 1758, where they have this kind of abortive attempt to capture Fort Duquesne. They also go to Braddock's battlefield and start to bury the troops that were still remaining there from 1755. And then on December 3rd, Forbes leaves for Philadelphia. It takes him 6 weeks to get back to Philadelphia. He leaves a guy named Hugh Mercer in command of the point with 200 soldiers.
That's it?
That's it. From 7,000 to 200. And Mercer is charged with constructing a fort at the forks of the Ohio and maintaining control of the area over the winter and into the following spring. And, so if you're Mercer, you have really drawn the short straw.
Yeah.
To have to stay there.
Did it go okay?
Yeah. So the French never did come back, but there were rumors were swirling that the French were going to come back at the very first opportunity and annihilate Mercer and his troops and regain possession. But it never actually materialized. So Mercer's building his fort, and you can imagine they're cutting trees and things. It's a wooden fort. They're building it out of logs that they're cutting down. In the spring of 1759. Civilians start to come to Pittsburgh because there's a military occupation there. And so people called sutlers who sell goods and services to the military start to come over the mountains. And so this little village pops up next to Mercer's fort. And so in September of 1759, when Fort Pitt is laid out. There's Mercer's Fort, and then there's this little town of Pittsburgh that's grown up kind of next to it. And it's sutlers who are selling, agricultural products, but it's also blacksmiths, it's soldiers who are living outside the fort and their families in many cases. So they're kids running around, Fort Pitt from 1759 onward. It takes them 2 years to complete the fort itself, which is a massive, giant, fortification.
So why do other people claim that maybe November 27th is our birthday? If you type it into Google, that is what you find right now.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the kind of letter writing and the spreading of the news that goes out from Fort Duquesne at that point. And Forbes writes a letter to William Pitt, who's sort of the equivalent of the Secretary of State in England, the architect of the British victory in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And he says something like, I've taken the liberty of giving your name to this place because I hope it's your spirit that has, kind of actuated our victory.
It's a tremendous amount of butt kissing of one's boss that got us the name that we did.
And that letter is dated the 27th, but there are others that go out and,
well before then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how do you sit with, some of this history, and especially because it always falls right here around Thanksgiving, and just like what it means to, quote unquote, celebrate something like that or mark it, because, it is a marker of colonialism and everything that comes along with that. How do you talk about that in terms of, the Fort Pitt Museum and honoring this history, but also being honest about it too?
Yeah, I think it's, to be a historian is to deal with the complexity of history. And so on the one hand, this is the birth of the Steel City, and, we think of Thanksgiving, which falls around that time. That's the first thing they did when they arrived was Forbes declared on the 26th a public day of Thanksgiving for the victory, which occurs, he says, without stroke of sword. So, no loss of life essentially at that moment when they took control of Fort Duquesne. And it's also the time of our national holiday of Thanksgiving. And so, for people in Pittsburgh, it's like one of the things we're thankful for is Pittsburgh because it's awesome. But, I think it's also in our house because everybody in our home is born in the fall. We always think of that season as a time for kind of reflection. We look at the past year, we look at the year ahead, and we kind of assess where we are and take some time for introspection. I think it's also a good time to think about the native tribes who were here in the region when the British and French declared an international war in their homeland, who were subsequently displaced and who don't live in Pennsylvania anymore as a result of all these factors. And so I think that's important to kind of keep in your mind, educate yourself about. We have an exhibit now called Homelands, Native Nations of Allegheny.
Which I know you did in collaboration with a lot of those nations as well.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time going back and forth between Pennsylvania and Oklahoma, where most of the Delaware tribes, the Shawnee tribes, and the Seneca-Cayuga Nation reside, and also up to New York, where the Seneca Nation is headquartered. It gives a whole other perspective to the region's history, things that we thought we understood. We realize, there's an entire other viewpoint to consider here. We can't go back and change the past, but I think we can change the way that we do things going forward. And I think that's one way we can do it is kind of make contact with these folks and, kind of invite them back into this conversation about our shared history.
Yeah. Well, with all of that in mind, how would you recommend that folks maybe mark a day like a city's birthday and learn more about its history? I'm sure your own exhibit, but anything beyond that?
Yeah, I think it's worth coming downtown, seeing some of the historic sites on foot. Obviously, the Fort Pitt Museum is a good place to stop, the Heinz History Center. But, there's so many sites in and around Pittsburgh that have these connections to this earlier period. The burying ground at Trinity Church is an 18th century burying ground. There's a Shawnee leader buried there named Redpole. But the other thing you can do is just take a walk down to the point and see it, just take a look out over the Ohio River because 260 something years ago, this was one of the most important pieces of ground in all of North America and is still obviously pretty important today.
Well, Mike Burke, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and happy birthday to Adrian.
Thank you. And I'll relay that. Happy birthday, honey.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you're liking the show, you can find so much more, all of our episodes, anything that's ever been in our Hey Pittsburgh newsletter, all on our website. It's pittsburgh.citycast.fm. We will be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Talk to you soon. So do y'all acknowledge the other birthday then, when Pittsburgh was officially incorporated into the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I think it's okay to celebrate twice. But, so Fort Pitt itself is essentially defunct by the mid-1790s. It's decommissioned by the United States government, and they built another little fort downtown, or what's now downtown, called Fort Lafayette, and that's where Lewis and Clark leave from in 1803. So Fort Pitt, by the time the city's incorporated in 1816, Fort Pitt is long gone. It lives on in our hearts.
Yeah, it pays your paycheck.
That's right.